Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my initial review and impression of the new Natasha Denona Mini Triochrome palette. I was really excited to pick this up. In fact, when I first heard she was going to do a mini Triochrome, that was really exciting to me because I do have her original larger Triochrome palette, and I feel like this is a very underrated Natasha Denona palette. It is very colorful, and I will say if you're someone who really likes sparkly indie shadows, then these multichromes are going to be kind of underwhelming. They're not the most shiny on the lids. But I love this palette because the curation of mattes is just so unique and versatile, and I find myself whenever I want to do a colorful look, especially a colorful look with my indie shadows, this is the palette I use to set it up with these mattes. And so I actually have gotten a lot more use out of this palette than I thought. If you guys watched my initial review of this palette, I wasn't quite sure how to feel about it, but it's definitely risen to be one of my more favorite or more unique Natasha Denona palettes in terms of the role it plays in my collection. And so when I first heard that this was coming out, I was super excited. I was really surprised at the color story since I thought it would be more like kind of an edited down version of this palette, and it's meant instead to be a complement, so as if Triochrome had an additional row. But I really loved all of the promo images from Natasha Denona, and honestly, I've been feeling not super inspired by most of the recent releases, especially around eyeshadow. And so this was just a fun breath of fresh air, something totally different than what the other brands are putting on the market. And so that's why I decided to pick this up. And so for today's video, I'm going to first show you guys how I got today's look. Then I'm going to do some swatches and then a bunch of comparison swatches to try to find dupes in my collection. So if you guys are interested in learning more about this mini Triochrome palette, then just stick around. So this is actually future me here. I just finished watching and editing the footage, and I realized the lip color really didn't go well with this look. I personally found it pretty distracting throughout the video. So as I explain later in the video, I chose to use that lip color just because it was a lip pencil that I bought with this palette in this order. So I wanted to just, use all of them together. But I did just want to come back on and show you guys what the look looks like if you take that lip off. So I didn't apply anything else to my lips. I just removed what I had on, and I think what remains of the lip pencil actually looks like decently natural. So I think this looks better than what I showcased in the video. So in case you guys are curious, I think in the future when using this palette, I would definitely go in with a more muted lip. So either something that's kind of light pink or that's more neutral. I think the reddishness of the lip that I had on in the video is just a little bit too much, and you get too much like kind of red-blue vibes. So just wanted to come on and let you guys know that. Hopefully it's not too distracting for the rest of the video. So here we have the beautiful untouched palette. It has the shade names on the back and a 24-month shelf life. And the coloration of the palette is the same as the original Triochrome palette. So usually for my eyeshadow looks, I tend to just apply the shadows in the same way. Like typically what I would do is go in with this lightest matte as a transition shade, deepen it up with this shade as sort of a mid-tone shade, add this as the deepest shade, put this all over the lid, and then put this in the inner corner and inner third of the eye. But for this palette, I was really inspired by a lot of the inspo looks that Natasha Denona released on her YouTube channel. And so I actually wanted to do one of those looks to kind of break out of my typical makeup standards. And so I have pulled up her video, Reverse Smoky Eye Look. I think this is really pretty and is a way to hopefully use this palette that is slightly more approachable because the mattes are sort of concentrated along the lash line. I think this will be a little bit less intimidating than some of the other blue looks that I've seen. So let's try this out. So for this look, she actually starts first with the shade Arrow, and she puts this on the inner corners of the eyes. And I'm doing this with my Refer number 14 brush. I think she used a little bit of a denser brush, but I'm just going to slowly build it up using this brush. Interesting. This shade has a lot less blue on my skin tone, I think, than it does in pan. Maybe because of the golden undertones in my skin, I feel like it kind of neutralizes the blue a little bit and makes it just look silver, but still really pretty. Very, very reflective, as you guys can see. And then I've never done this before, but she actually goes in next with this baby blue shade, which is Overcast, and she uses this also in the inner corner area and then along the lower lash line. So she kind of uses it to blend out the arrow shade. And I'm actually really impressed, wow, like how pigmented that is. So usually for pastel shades, I expect them to take a lot more building up because typically they're pretty light. But you see, I just dipped in once and then I've gotten this much pigmentation, which is actually really impressive. So that's nice because if you want to use this all over the lids, I feel like it'll give you a good amount of opacity. This is notably more opaque than a lot of the pastel shades she has in her pastel palette. So I will give you guys some comparisons with this later on. But so far, I'm liking this formula. With her minis, sometimes the formulas are a bit hit or miss, and especially for all blue palette, I was a little bit worried, but so far, so good. And side note, in case you guys are curious, my face is mostly bare right now. I did put some of my Natasha Denona concealer just like on my blemishes, and then I put eye primer on, my ABH eye primer. But I decided I would do everything else complexion-wise afterward just because since it's blue, I feel like it's really hard to kind of clean up later on if you do have fallout. Though so far, that hasn't been an issue. So next up, she takes Stratos, this deepest shade, and uses it to strategically line parts of the eye. So she first takes some for kind of the inner portion of the eye. This is really different from what I typically do, so hopefully I don't mess it up. But she kind of avoids the center part, so she sort of does a V on the inner part like this, and then she uses it on the outer portion of the eye and kind of extends it on the top part as well. So this shade, while being the most pigmented in the palette, definitely is not necessarily the most pigmented shade ever. It reminds me a little bit of some of the teal shades in Metropolis, so I'll have to bring that out later. It looks super blue in pan, but I feel like on the skin, it has a slightly teal undertone to it. And cleaning off my brush now, I'm going into Voltaic. This is one of the most interesting shades in this palette. So she uses this kind of like on top of Stratos to sort of build it out a bit more, kind of to give a gradient effect. Oops, I just rewatched that and realized she actually put it on the lower lash line closer to the other side. So I guess, I don't know, mine will just be a slight riff on what she's doing, since I feel like if I now put Voltaic on the inner portion, it's gonna kind of mess up the overall vibe, because I do want to still have that gap like she has. I will say definitely in her video, everything applies sort of with greater pigmentation. Like this is still pigmented, but I'm definitely dipping in several times to get that opacity. But this is a very pretty shade. I think this shade Voltaic is probably the most unique shade in this palette. So I went off camera to repeat what I did on this side. They're definitely cousins, not twins, but hopefully we can sort of fix that gradually over time. So next up, I'm gonna just still use that same Esom brush. By the way, this is the W21 brush, and now go into that Triochrome shade. And I feel like this is kind of the trickiest part of this look because she really uses this to carve out a slightly graphic shape. So hopefully I can do that. Usually with my looks, I tend to go for something that's a bit more blown out, so it's more forgiving, but let's try this technique out. And I will say with initial application, This will also probably take a little bit of building up to get full opacity. It's definitely not like a high shine shade. It's very smooth on the lids. I think if you're someone who doesn't like super glittery shades, then this is good. I do have a tiny bit of fallout, but I think considering the fact that I'm applying this with a brush, this is actually really good. In general, this palette doesn't have anything that's highly flaky, so it's quite forgiving in that respect. So that's quite nice, because I don't think I actually needed to do my complexion afterward. I think I could have done my makeup the way I normally do and not have had any issues. So overall, this is applying quite well. I will say, at least looking at the shade so far, it doesn't have a super prominent flip, so even though I'm giving it a lot of real estate on my lids, I don't feel like I see a ton of shift. There definitely is some shift kind of on the edges and such, but if you want something that is really high impact, you probably do need to look at indie shadows. I was wondering if Natasha Denona was going to reformulate this, because the main critique of the Triochrome palette was that the Multichromes didn't really pack much of a punch, and I think that is true of this as well. She has, since Triochrome, come out with a lot of palettes that do have really flaky, high-dimensional shades, but none that are in a Multichrome formula. But I guess she decided to just stick with her guns. Alrighty, there we go. That actually came together very easily. I will say this is not like kind of very everyday. I guess it's definitely a very high impact look, but really pretty and easy to put together though. So to finish off this look, she goes back in with Aero a bit just to kind of intensify, though I think I probably already have a decent amount of Aero on from before. Also, I think I need to put a little bit more of this shade on the lower lash line, kind of in that little gap. So I'm going to do that now just to make sure it is full pigmentation. So there we have it, the completed eyeshadow look. So I went off camera to finish most of my face. In case you guys are curious about any of the products, please check my description box. I tried to use as many Natasha Denona products as possible, and I think things turned out pretty nice. So for the lips, I did want to go in with you guys for this first impressions of her I Need a Nude lip crayon in the shade Renee. So I picked this up as part of this order because I really wanted the free shipping, and unfortunately this palette was not enough to get free shipping on its own, and so I really do love her lip crayons. It's my all-time favorite lip pencil formula, and so I have a few of these already, and recently I've been using Gaia a lot. That's also in this kind of pink family, so Emily is P7, Gaia is P5, and so I thought getting a deeper version would be kind of interesting because I have been going for these pinkier looks quite often. So as you can see, this is a very creamy formula. It glides on super well. Basically, what I love about this formula is that it's the most creamy, long-lasting formula I've ever tried. It's definitely like the most long-lasting lip pencil I've ever tried. And usually I find there's kind of a trade-off between how creamy and easy to apply a lip pencil is versus how long-lasting it is, but this manages to maximize both. So this is a pretty deep shade. Honestly, most of the time I think I would just use this to line my lips and then go in with a lighter shade in between, but today I really want to showcase this, so I'm going to actually fill in my lips entirely. So here are my lips filled in completely, and I also wanted to briefly just show you guys a swatch comparison for this. So here we have the new shade Renee, and then I also whipped out Gaia, the shade I just mentioned. This has been like my most favorite lip pencil lately. So Gaia is just a bit more pinky, a bit lighter, and Renee is just a little bit deeper. So on its own, this actually doesn't feel bad as a standalone lip product. It's not super drying or anything, but I do like to have a little bit of gloss on top, so I'm going to go in with my Lawless Forget the Filler lip gloss. This is definitely by far my favorite plumping lip gloss. Usually I'm actually not a fan of lip plumpers because I don't really like the sensation of like tingling or burning on my lips. But I really like this because it basically just makes your lips feel a little bit cooler. It doesn't have any other unpleasant feeling. And as you can see, it makes your lips look super juicy, and I do feel like it actually has a plumping effect. So here we have the overall finished look. It's definitely a lot more intense than I originally anticipated, but I'm really loving it. I think this is super beautiful, and considering this is an eyeshadow technique I've never done before, I am quite impressed with just how well this turned out. I think Natasha Denona's tutorial, even though it was super fast, was really easy to follow, and I'm really pleased with the results. So zooming you guys out, let's now get into swatches and comparison swatches. And side note, I actually went off camera to wash my hands to prepare them for swatches. And as you can see, the lip liner, even though I just applied it to my hand, is completely budge proof. Like, I tried scrubbing this off with soap and it did not move whatsoever. So I honestly probably shouldn't have put this on right before the swatches, but yeah, at least this proves my point about the longevity. So let me first just start by swatching the shades themselves. And I'm going to swatch them by formula so you can see all the mattes together. So we're going to first start with this Overcast shade. This is a creamy matte formulation, which is her standard powder matte. You can see how this looks quite pigmented. I think in pan it looks like it'll be a more like powder blue shade because it's a lot lighter than the other ones, but it definitely packs a punch both in swatch and on the lids. Next we have Voltaic. This is a very eye-catching shade. It almost has a slight neon effect to it. It's so bright, but really, really beautiful. Very nice royal blue. I will say though, at least in today's look, it didn't necessarily distinguish itself a lot against Stratos. I expected a bit more distinction between the two on the eyes, but still really pretty. And now let's swatch Stratos, and I should mention all three of these mattes are in her creamy matte formula, so that's her kind of drier powder formulation. I do think it's interesting that this palette, even though it's overall such an overwhelmingly blue color story, when you actually look at the undertones, there are some differences. So part of the reason I wore this outfit today is I did want to play off some of the sort of greenish teal elements that you see both in the Triochrome shade and also in this Stratos shade. Sorry for the cut, but I went off camera because I got a blue smudge on my face because I had the swatches still on my fingers, so I just went to conceal that with some concealer. But anyway, what I was saying was I think it's nice that you have those different undertones because you can use this palette in a way that is a little bit more green leaning or that's like pure blue, especially with Aero. I think that gives more of that kind of icy blue effect. So now for the metallics, first we have Aero. This is a standard metallic formula. Really pretty, really easygoing. I'm very curious to see how this compares to some of the shades she has in Circo Loco and also in Pastel. And then we have Strike. This is the Multichrome shade. And it is a very pretty shade, basically the exact same shade as the Triochrome palettes themselves. So you can see it's predominantly teal, but shifts to blue and purple. So I think that's kind of cute that she made a shade that looks exactly like the palette itself. To show you what I mean, here is the palette, and you can see it looks basically the same as this shade, so it's a very cute homage to that. Definitely not the most high shine shade ever. I do feel like in her promo pics and videos, you do get the sense that it's shinier than it actually is in person, but it's still very beautiful and it is easier to use than other multi-chromes just by virtue of the smoothness. So now let's pull out some palettes for comparisons. So of course we have to whip out Triochrome since this is basically supposed to be an extension of Triochrome. And I think it overall fits. It is, I think, a bit more vibrant than Triochrome, which is overall a pretty grungy palette and is not that cool toned. Like the green shades in Triochrome have sort of a yellowy undertone to them. And the bottom row is also more kind of neutral, leaning warm. So this definitely extends it and is quite distinct from the existing shades. So there obviously aren't any dupes here, but I did just want to swatch for you guys the Triochrome shades themselves so you could see just how this new formula compares with the existing ones. So here are the original Triochrome shades. Let's swatch them here. I'm actually going to swatch the purple one, Kinetic, first because I think that's the most similar. And then we have Color Flip. This one is kind of pink to green. And then we have my favorite one, Scarab, which is actually, I think, the most eye-catching of the shades. It's a little bit shiftier than the others, but definitely they're all kind of in the same basic formula. As you can see, they don't have a ton of shine to them, but are still really beautiful, smooth multi-chromes. Next, I want to show this next to Circo Loco since I think they have somewhat similar vibes with the colorful bluish teal shades. So there's not any shades I think that are quite dupes, but let me swatch Snow Cone. I think this is a little bit similar to Arrow. So kind of running out of room, but I'm gonna put it just right here. And okay, you can see those are definitely distinct shades. So Snow Cone is a lot more blue and is also a much higher shine metallic in comparison to Arrow. Let's also just go into Acrobat. I want to see this next to Stratos because of that slightly teal undertone. And they actually do look fairly similar. I think there's maybe a little bit more green in Acrobat in comparison to Stratos, but I guess if you wanted to dupe this palette, these two are not terribly dissimilar. And then here is the palette next to Pastel. So the main shade I thought of here was the baby blue shades. So let's go into Airy and also into Bubble. I kind of feel like the Overcast shade is a little bit of a mix between these two. So let's put Airy on top. That is definitely more baby blue. And then Bubble on the bottom. Okay, actually Bubble is a reasonable dupe. Those two actually look pretty similar to each other. And then before we move on, I realize also Aerialist here might also be a little bit similar to the Arrow shade. So I'm also just going to put Aerialist here. Okay, I think Aerialist is actually a lot more similar. So you can see that over here. It's a bit higher shine than Arrow and has more of a purpley base than a blue one, but honestly both of them on my skin tend to come across as silver. Next, let's go into Metropolis, one of my OG favorite Natasha Denona palettes. So here they are side by side, definitely overall very different color stories, but you can see there are some of those deeper bluish teal shades in Metropolis. So I'm gonna swatch those and see how they compare. So this is Symbol and this is Enigma. Both of these are in her creamed powder, so they are a different formula. Let's see, I guess swatch these over here. So Symbol on top, a little bit more of a forest green in comparison to Stratos, and then Enigma over here. Okay, yeah, both of these, sorry it's a little bit messy, but both of these are definitely more forest green and honestly closer to each other than they are to Stratos. Though on the whole, I would say on the lids, if you don't want to buy this palette, I think any of these three aren't going to be crazy different than Stratos. If you do have a navy blue in your collection, I think if you mixed any of these with a navy blue, you'd get something kind of similar. Speaking of navy blue, the final swatch comparison I wanted to do was with my Celestial Nirvana palette from Pat McGrath. So this was the holiday palette from last year, and I'm just gonna put this over here. So yeah, that is definitely a lot deeper than Voltaic. though somewhat similar to Stratos in depth. I think it's still a little bit deeper than Stratos as well. Basically, I think if you mixed this shade with any of these teal shades, you'd get something pretty similar to Stratos. So in case you're interested in this kind of look and don't want to pick up a whole palette for it, I think there are some potentially promising dupes that you might or might not have in your existing collection already. In terms of the Triochrome itself, I don't have anything that I think quite fits the bill, though honestly this shade Kinetic is maybe somewhat similar if you are okay with it being a little bit more on the purple side of things. Overall though, it's definitely a very unique color story. I've never had a palette that is so blue, and I will say I really appreciate the fact that Natasha Denona has pushed the envelope and gone with a color story that other brands typically shy away from because it is not necessarily the most popular. But I really love this look. I think it is super, super beautiful, really gorgeous. So I'm pretty happy with this. And even though I don't think I'm really gonna be traveling with this palette anytime soon, I think it's just such a cute little addition to your collection. If you're someone who likes blues, but you don't want to get like a huge palette like any of these other ones in order to get a few blue shades, you just want a bunch of them in one, then I think this is a really excellent way to go. In terms of the quality of the palette, I wouldn't say that the shades necessarily blew me away, but considering the fact that these are blue shades that are typically really hard to formulate, the fact that I didn't have any problems with them and honestly had really, really minimal fallout was very impressive to me. Basically, I would say that this shade was extraordinarily easy to apply. That was impressive. These two did take more building up, but I think that's pretty common for this sort of color story just because it is really hard to get that really rich blue. And then the shimmers were, you know, kind of your standard metallics, nothing fussy, pretty easy to use. This one applied with a brush did have a tiny bit of fallout, but honestly not that much at all. This one has some kick up in the pan, but I didn't have any issues with fallout on the eyes. So on the whole, I am really pleased with this little palette. In terms of recommendations, I would say it really mostly just comes down to this color story. I think for most people, this color story is not something they're gonna reach for that often, but if you are a makeup collector, you like to have different sorts of unique color stories, this one's definitely quite unique. If you like sort of mermaid core or siren core, anything like that, I think this is a really easy way to achieve a look that looks way more complicated than it actually is. And if you're just bored of the releases that kind of all look the same, then I think this is a really fun way to kind of spice things up, remind yourself of the fun of makeup and creating new looks. At least for me, that's how today felt. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.